Hi everyone, today's video is how I did Bodhi here in acrylics. So as you've seen from other videos, regardless of what medium, I always start with the eyes. Now I did Bodhi's a little bit different how I would with normal portraits because his eyes were quite a unique colour, so I actually did them both at the same time. Usually I'll do one eye, get that up finished, and then I'll make a start on the other one. But while I had the colours mixed on my palette, I decided to do both eyes at the same time. Once I'd mixed this nice yellow ochre colour, I wanted to make sure that obviously it didn't dry my palette, so that's why I did both eyes at the same time. I actually had the pleasure of photographing Bodhi for this for his painting, so it was really nice to meet him. So as you've seen from other videos, I start with applying my base layers. These look absolutely terrible. You have to go through the ugly stage in order to get to the point where you can add your details on top, which is my favourite part of every painting or drawing. And what I tend to do while it's drying, you can see here I'm now adding some details to the eyes, the reflections, making sure I've got the darkest part of the eyelids in. For this I'm actually using a Winsor & Newton, which is the red brush. I'm going to add the brushes that I'm using in the description below, so pop down there if you want to have a look at those. Now the paints that I'm using is Liquitex Basics, and you can see that the base layers that I've put down are quite translucent. It's normal with this brand of paint. It can be frustrating, and that is why some people don't like this paint. However, it's really good for glazing, and that is how I like to work, especially once you've got your few layers down and you're actually trying to tint your details on top. So I'm going to make a focus video on how I glaze, but for now this is why I just prefer this paint over other brands. So I'm focusing on smaller areas, getting these up to about 80% complete before I move on to the next part. Once I've got my base layers down, and I'll leave that bit to dry, I'll just work on the part next to it, like what I'm doing here on the bridge of the nose and above his eye. So I typically work in really small brushes. It's just so that I can try and get as much detail in each layer as I possibly can. And while I'm waiting for the left side to dry, I'm now blocking in my base colours on my right side. Now obviously this is a bit of a smaller size on the other side of his face, so I'll stick to my smaller brushes again for that reason. Now I did think a focus video would be quite nice on how to do a Spaniel's ear, regardless if that's in acrylics or pastels, because techniques for acrylics will also work with pastels and vice versa. So there are tips, and the way that you layer and the way that you put down colour is very same in both mediums. So while the ear is drying, I'm now just adding some more detailed layers to the right hand side of the portrait. Again, this is with that Winsor & Newton, that red brush that I'm using, which has got a really nice fine, it's a smaller brush, it's got really nice fine bristles, so it's really good for detail. So with any paint really, oils, acrylics or anything, you want to make sure that the layer before is completely dry before you put your next layer on top, because all you'll do is take that layer and the paint off, and the next layer just will not stick to it properly. Now I used to prefer oils, that was my very first medium I guess, over acrylics. However, I really didn't like the drying time. I just find that it slows everything down. So it's a really nice medium to work in, but it's just not practical for how I like to work. So when you're working on an ear like this, what you want to do is you want to get in your basic shapes first. So put in where your darkest shadows are and then the highlights, and make sure you follow in the direction of the fur, obviously because the curls, that's really important. But put in where your darks are and where your highlights are, and just map in the basic shapes, and then that will be it will set you up for being able to actually put in the detail in the right places. So drawing or painting noses can be one of those things that can be a bit difficult. So I do actually have a tutorial on my acrylics playlist with a voiceover showing how I did a painting of my own dog's nose. So I'll pop a card in the corner here for you to watch that if that's of interest. So once that first layer of the nose is drying, I'm now blocking in some of the colours on the bridge of the nose. And as you can see, these layers look terrible. That is absolutely fine. Don't worry about it. They all look like this at this stage. So now I'm adding my second layer, just reinforcing where those mid-tones, where the shadows are, making sure you get that line in the middle of his nose. And you want to pay really close attention to the shape of the nostrils and make sure that they're in the right position, because if you get the nostrils slightly in the wrong place, either too narrow or obviously too far apart, it won't look right. So pay really close attention to these kinds of details and make sure that your proportions are correct. Now with this, Bodhi had a nice highlight on the top of his nose, so capturing those kinds of details is what's going to make that nose look like wetter, and capturing those highlights is what will make it that much more realistic. So now I'm just blocking in more base layers. Again, with a really small brush, it's just how I prefer to work. This is my Daler and Rowney Filbert that I'm using here to do these base layers. And again, I'm not that fussy on which brand of paintbrushes I use. They all tend to do the same thing, so I'm not fussy about that. And they last forever. So, I mean, I've got hundreds of paintbrushes here, which I haven't even used. So now I'm starting to go in and add some details, focusing on where the fur direction sits. The thickness of the strokes is also important. The more pressure you put on the brush, the thicker your paint line will be. So obviously that's something to bear in mind. So you can have one brush and you can create various brush strokes using that one brush. Now you also want to be careful with how much paint is loaded on your brush. You don't want too much, because when you go to put that paintbrush on your canvas, you'll get a blob and then your line, which obviously isn't ideal. If you're having that problem, it's either because your paint is a bit too thin, or you're just loading too much paint on that brush. So you can either roll the paintbrush as you're loading the paint on, and that will tend to help, or just dab it off on a bit of paper towel before you put that paintbrush on your canvas. So Bodhi had a lot of variation in his fur, so some really subtle differences between the shadows and the highlights. So it's really important to pay really close attention and mix in those various colours so that you make sure that your portrait isn't flat. So you want to capture, as I'm doing here, as the muzzle curls over, and that is just some really subtle mid-tones added on top of your shadows, on top of your darker points of your portrait. Now the colours that I've been using here that I put on my palette is typically burnt umber, raw sienna, raw umber. You've got obviously your black and your white, but you want to have colours as close to your reference photo as you can. So what I'll do is I'll pick out my main colours, the ones that I've just listed. Yellow ochre is another one, and then I will mix my colours on my palette from there. So you can have those set colours out in front of you, but you can't really list the exact colours that you're using at that time, because I mix on my palette so many colours to create as close as the colour as I can. Now the good thing with acrylics, you can tint your colour. So if you put your colour that you've mixed on your canvas and it's not right, it really doesn't matter, because what you can do is you can use a glaze, mix that colour in a glaze to how you want it, and then apply that glaze to your finished, to a dry layer. It has to be completely dry before you add your glaze on top, because all you'll do then is you'll just blend and blur out that layer underneath. So once you've got your colour completely, it's completely dry, then add your glaze on top, and that will change the colour of that previous layer, which might not be the exact colour that you were looking for. And this is why I really like Liquitex Basics, because you don't have to be 100% accurate with your colour at that time that you're doing the layer. You can change this so easily with this paint. It's really, really nice to work with for this type of way, this type of technique. So now I'm just blocking in my base layers here for around the mouth. The process is very similar. So you just start from your darks and work your midtones and your lights on top of that. Paying really close attention to your reference photo, these subtle differences in colour and tone. Making sure you get your lights bright enough and your darks dark enough. That will be what makes your portrait more realistic compared to getting the colour exactly right. Because I could take this photo of Bodhi that was slightly overcast, and the colouring in his fur would look different to what it is in the reference photo that I've got. So just bear that in mind. But you want to make sure in any reference photo that you've got that you get your contrast right, your darks dark enough and your lights bright enough. So I've got his face about 80% complete, so I'm now moving on to the next section. And I like to work like this because, as I've said before in my other videos, I'll take a photo of the portrait and I'll then notice what I need to change. So I'll step back and I'll usually put the painting to the side for a day, and then I'll go back to it the following day with fresh eyes, and then you tend to notice things that might need to be tweaked. Whereas if you've been working flat out on a painting or a portrait for days on end, these things can get lost. You can just get too focused on what you're doing and not really notice the bits that need to be tweaked at that time. So the biggest tip that I can give you when drawing white fur like Bodhi's chest here is white is never really white. White is really reflective, so it's reflecting a lot of the brown tones from his ear there and from his neck. So, and it's reflecting all that light from the surroundings as well. So white is never white. Don't just put pure white down. You can see here I've put a light grey, a warm grey down. All I've done is mixed some burnt umber with a bit of my titanium white and a tiny bit of my black to create a warmer grey. Once you've got this base down, you can then go and add your whiter shade. So all I do is use that same mixture that I've just mixed for my base tones, but add more titanium white to it to get a slightly lighter colour, and then work your layers from dark to light based on that. Also, when you're doing fur such as Bodhi's chest here, really pay attention to the different length of the fur strokes. Obviously the fur on his face is it's tiny fur strokes, whereas on their chest, because it's longer fur, you're going to be wanting to use a brush like a liner brush to make sure that you can create those swooping longer lines much easier. This purple lilac brush that I'm using now, I want to cry every time I use it because I can't actually get any more. I think I got them from a little art shop and I cannot find them anywhere online, so that makes me want to cry. But again, this is just like a liner brush, so any other liner brush you could get the same effect with that. I hope this video was of use. Please don't forget to give it a thumbs up if it was, and subscribe and hit the bell button so you get notified of future content. I don't actually know what my next tutorial is going to be yet. I am going to start adding some graphite tutorials as well, so maybe I might do something like that. But if there's any suggestions that any topics that you want me to cover, then pop it in the comments below. Thank you, bye!